The first memory of Confessor Avidian did not arrive as an introduction but as an intrusion. It came as the metallic scent of blood suspended in recycled air, as a tremor rippling along the deck, plating beneath my boots as something old and wounded, shifting in the darkness beyond the landing ramp. It came as a sensation rather than a sight, like a steel spine pressing lightly against the back of my mind, a warning delivered without words. Even before I saw him, I felt the gravity he generated, the way a collapsing star might bend light before revealing its burning mass. The landing ramp had barely settled when the atmosphere of the Forge moon seeped into the gunship, a cold, mechanical breath laced with iron dust and the faint sting of ozone. The environment carried a pressure that clung to the senses, as though each gust were weighted with expectation. It pressed against armor, slipped beneath the seals, found the hollows of bone and memory. I stepped onto the metal surface, letting the vibration of distant industry travel up through greaves, femurs, the reinforced lattice of my frame. The place seemed alive in a way that machines were not meant to be, pulsing unevenly, like a wounded beast clinging to consciousness. Avidian emerged from the haze, not as a silhouette, but as a distortion, a figure that forced the mind to reassess proportions, to accept that the human frame could be reorganized into a shrine of pain. His movements carried a deliberate slowness, each gesture carved from restraint rather than effort. His flesh appeared woven with metal, not in the careful symmetry of augmentation, but in erratic grafts that followed scars rather than anatomy. Sheets of sanctified steel clung to muscle like ritual armor, fused directly with bone. Entire sections of his skin had darkened from repeated cauterization, forming patches of char that mapped his past with grim precision. The air around him carried heat without fire, the residual warmth of rituals performed too recently and too violently. Several lengths of wire, still faintly glowing, clung to his arms as though forgotten. Their ends were crusted with blood that had dried in layered patterns, each layer a testament to a previous devotion. His gait had a rigidity that suggested nerve damage, or perhaps intentional paralysis, a self-inflicted limitation meant to remind him of fragility. Nothing about him seemed accidental. Every injury, every mutilation, every embedded fragment appeared, chosen, curated, offered. There was no voice to greet me, no formal acknowledgement. His presence alone filled the space with something heavier than ceremony, something that pressed against instinct and logic alike. He radiated a form of conviction that bypassed spoken doctrine, a conviction that carved its own reality through sheer intensity. Standing before him, the mind did not reach for questions. It reached for stability. The air vibrated slightly as he lifted his arm, and the motion revealed deeper damaged tendons exposed through split flesh circuitry meshing with tissue in ways that defied both biology and engineering. His body was a litany written in mutilation, a scripture recorded in burning metal and torn skin. The smell of his wounds, charred tissue, sanctified oils, scorched incense carried an intoxicating weight, a mixture of reverence and revulsion that coated the lungs and tasted faintly of old machinery. Rumors had painted him as a zealot of the Ministorum, one who had wandered across dozens of war zones carrying nothing but the implements of penance. Yet rumors felt insufficient now, as though words were too fragile to carry what stood before me. His existence seemed to have evolved beyond the parameters of simple devotion. There was something predatory in his serenity, a poise that suggested he hunted impurity not with rage, but with the inexorable patience of corrosion. I recognized the pattern of his breathing, shallow, uneven, punctuated by faint tremors, not exhaustion, adaptation. His body had learned to function while damaged beyond recovery, to operate under the constant erosion of pain. His movements had the weight of someone accustomed to enduring his own deterioration, someone who viewed survival not as necessity, but as prolonged offering. Watching him for even a moment, it became clear that suffering was not merely a practice for him. It was his medium, his means of sculpting identity. My arrival held no significance to him. I felt this in the way he passed by without hesitation, as though my presence were just another component within a ritual that neither began nor ended with me. The Forge moon thrummed beneath us, its rhythm aligning gradually with the cadence of his steps. It felt as though the environment itself responded to his presence, tightening, focusing, aligning. The forges cycled their heat in distant chambers, pressure valves exhaled with nervous regularity, and the wind that cut across the landing bay carried an edge shaped by his aura. The world adjusted to him rather than the inverse. His followers trailed behind him, each bearing ritual wounds that seemed pale echoes of the devastation he wore. Their expressions blended fervor with something quieter, something that resembled surrender. Their eyes did not seek guidance, they sought dissolution. They bore their injuries like talismans, but in their posture there lingered the shadow of longing, the desire to be unmade, in the same way their confessor had unmade himself. Their pain felt borrowed, his seemed owned. The sight of them stirred a faint pressure beneath my sternum, not fear but a recognition of something fundamentally incompatible with my own engineered nature. Their devotion was consumptive, feeding on itself, devouring hesitation, identity, instinct. It was devotion that wished to extinguish the self entirely, whereas mine, rebuilt through genecraft and discipline, was designed to preserve the vessel so it might continue in service. Their path spiraled inward toward annihilation, mine extended outward toward endurance. Standing among them felt like standing before a mirror that reflected not my image, but the absence of it. Avidian paused near a towering pillar of rusted machinery, and though he did not turn, the air shifted around him with a tension that suggested the beginning of a ritual rather than an interruption. His followers arranged themselves instinctively, forming a loose semicircle that framed him without confining him. They lowered their heads not in reverence but in surrender, as though bracing themselves for a force that might sweep through them. I felt the vibration first, a pulse of heat without flame, a tremor without impact. It crawled across the surface of my armor, seeped through the joints, brushed against the neural weave. He extended his arm toward the machinery, and heat radiated from the exposed tendons and metallic grafts along his limb. The wires embedded in his flesh began to glow faintly, returning to life like coals stirred in an old brazier. His body responded with an almost imperceptible convulsion, a reflex suppressed through years of conditioning. Pain rippled through him, visible in the tightening of scarred muscles, but his posture remained unchanged. He held the heat as though it were a living presence pressed against his skin, something intimate and familiar. The machine responded to him in a way that defied mechanical logic. A low hum vibrated through the metal as though acknowledging him. Panels shuddered, gears shifted, and the air filled with a faint static crackle. The Confessor did not command it. He provoked it, coaxed a reaction through the medium of his own agony. His body became a conduit, a ritual offering that invited the machinery to awaken not through maintenance but through empathy, an empathy forged from shared suffering. Watching him, I felt an unease that lodged deep in the spine, a sensation like cold iron sliding slowly beneath bone. His ritual contained no words, no gestures of supplication, no structure recognizable from ecclesiarch rites. It was raw, instinctive, a communion of blood and metal that ignored doctrine entirely. For a moment, the forge moon seemed to inhale alongside him, drawing his torment into its own wounded systems, integrating it into its breath and pulse. His followers trembled. Some clutched their ritual wounds, fingers pressing into lacerations as if afraid their pain might be insufficient. Their breathing quickened as heat radiated outward from their confessor, not enough to injure them but enough to remind them of their own fragility. The atmosphere thickened, tingling against the skin, pressing against the mind. Even my transhuman physiology registered the discomfort as an intrusion, a reminder that the world here operated under a different logic, one that cared little for endurance or preservation. It became clear that Avidian did not seek purity, repentance, or redemption. What he sought was dissolution, the gradual erasure of the boundary between himself and the machine. His body, scarred and failing, was not a testament to faith but a vessel being hollowed for occupation. Each wound traced the path of an intention, each burn another step toward becoming something else, something that no longer differentiated flesh from metal. His suffering served not as punishment, but as transition. I understood then that the campaign ahead would not be defined by strategy or doctrine. It would be defined by the gravitational pull of one man's unraveling. Whatever path he carved, his followers would walk. Whatever pain he embraced, they would mimic. Whatever ruin he sought, they would welcome. The forge moon trembled beneath the weight of his faith, and I felt the first hint of dread, not for the battles to come, but for the shape the war would carve into those who followed him. Avidian withdrew his arm from the machine, and the heat faded, leaving the air strangely hollow. The machinery settled into silence, the forge moon resumed its wounded rhythm, and the followers lifted their heads with expressions that blended relief and hunger. The confessor turned away without ceremony, as though the ritual had required no witness and offered no revelation. His presence receded into the forge haze, leaving only the imprint of heat along the senses and the faint tremor of machinery awakening reluctantly to its own pain. I followed not out of obedience or curiosity, but because the campaign ahead had aligned itself around him. His descent had already begun, and the war like a beast drawn to blood followed close behind. The order to accompany Confessor Avidian came without fanfare, delivered in a manner that felt less like command and more like inevitability. The Mechanicus priests made gestures of acknowledgement around me, their movements precise, ritualistic, and devoid of curiosity. Whatever had been arranged for this campaign had been designed long before my arrival, and my presence served only as a weight added to an already descending scale. Avidian moved through the Forge Moon's inner corridors, with the certainty of someone walking paths carved by memory rather than design. His gait remained unnatural, measured not by efficiency but by discipline shaped through pain. Each step carried the faintest hesitation, not born of weakness, but of the quiet anticipation of discomfort. It became clear he welcomed the friction of muscle against metal grafts, the grind of bone against embedded shards. His body had become a liturgical instrument, and pain was the resonance it produced. Following him was like walking in the wake of a descending temperature, not physical cold but a draining of vitality in the air. The Mechanicus acolytes, maintaining the outer corridors, paused when he passed, as though his presence required recalibration of their senses. Some bowed their heads slightly, others reached for their ritual wounds in unconscious mimicry. He drew devotion from them without request, the kind of reverence that formed naturally when confronted with someone who had abandoned self-preservation entirely. The route unfolded through a sequence of maintenance chambers and transit platforms, each layered with the residue of past operations. The machinery that lined the corridors vibrated irregularly, emitting rhythms that suggested exhaustion rather than function. The Forge Moon had clearly endured years of conflict, but the instability in its systems came from something deeper than neglect. It felt as though the very infrastructure recoiled from what had been done within it, shrinking away from rituals that pushed machinery into forms of sentience born from torment rather than design. Avidian entered the primary transit platform reserved for strategic deployments. The deck plates were stained with old burn markings, irregular shapes left behind by fires not meant for industrial purpose. The air carried a tension that clung to the senses, growing tighter with each breath, as though the Forge Moon recognized what was about to be asked of it and resisted in subtle, failing ways. Dozens of soldiers, priests, and attendants formed the strike group. Their appearances varied. Some were nearly unaugmented humans, others were so intertwined with machinery that their silhouettes looked sculpted rather than grown. Yet all of them bore wounds. Some fresh, some scarred, some clearly self-inflicted minutes before my arrival. They touched their wounds with reverence, tracing lines of dried blood, pressing fingertips into raw tissue to reacquaint themselves with discomfort. It created a low, almost inaudible chorus of breathless anticipation, as though the entire group waited for a signal that would allow them to shed restraint. Their eyes shifted toward Avidian with a longing that felt uncomfortably intimate. His presence served as anchor and catalyst for their suffering, granting purpose to their pain. Behind those expressions lay surrender, an eagerness to be reshaped through agony into something worthy of whatever machine-bound divinity Avidian pursued. The transport vehicle assigned for the strike hummed with an energy that did not feel entirely mechanical. It vibrated unevenly, as though adjusting to accommodate the Confessor's presence. The floor plates grew faintly warm as he approached, reacting as though aware of its passenger. I stepped aboard, feeling the pulse of the transport resonate through my boots, traveling upward in a subtle shiver that lingered inside my armor. The sensation lacked the crisp precision of well-tuned machinery. Instead, it felt alive, trembling with something I could not name. Avidian took his place near the front of the transport, gripping a metal support with a hand barely recognizable as flesh. The patches of char spread along his arm looked recent, the burned tissue cracked, hinting at the deeper damage beneath. The wires embedded along his limbs began to pulse, faintly emitting a low warmth that radiated outward in shallow waves. The atmosphere grew heavier as the transport sealed. When the vehicle surged forward, the motion rippled through the group with a synchronized bracing of bodies, yet none clung for stability. Instead, they yielded to the movement, letting it shove their bodies against armor, plating benches, or each other. The jolt of impact seemed welcomed, another reminder of fragility to be tasted and preserved. The interior carried a silence shaped by tension rather than discipline. No one sought distraction, no one sought comfort. Their breaths formed a collective rhythm, shallow, strained, each exhalation ending in a faint, almost trembling release. The quiet deteriorated the boundary between individual awareness and shared fixation, creating a sensation of sinking into a group mind, held together by anticipation of pain. Ovidian's presence amplified every sensation. Even without movement, he radiated a gravity forged through deliberate self-decimation. Standing close to him felt like standing beside a wound in reality, one too deep to heal and too sacred to ignore. His body no longer moved in ways aligned with anatomy. Instead, his movements corresponded with the pulses of embedded metal. When a cable on his chest twitched, his shoulder shifted. When a strip of burned flesh pulled taut, his spine straightened. The boundaries between mechanics and biology dissolved across his form, creating an entity that existed somewhere between machine and flesh, without belonging fully to either. The transport's descent toward the factory district intensified those sensations. Vibrations grew harsher, scraping across armor plates. The environment outside shifted from the relative stability of upper transit lines into lower industrial sectors filled with wounded infrastructure. Every impact of the vehicle against uneven ground sent a jolt through every passenger, yet none recoiled. Instead, their bodies moved with the motion, embracing discomfort like a sacrament. The air inside grew thicker as heat bled from Ovidian's limbs. At times, the warmth carried a sharp edge, as though it tore microscopic layers from the skin, reminding each passenger of their own mortality. Breathing became an act of conscious effort, each inhale drawing in the metallic tang of oxidized blood, each exhale releasing faint traces of tension that accumulated faster than they dissipated. As the descent continued, the first hints of battle reached us not through sight or sound, but through vibration. The deck plating underfoot trembled with distant impacts, not explosive but blunt and rhythmic, like machinery straining under unnatural duress. The sensation traveled through the bones, settling deep behind the sternum, where instinct recognized danger even before the mind processed it. Ovidian's posture changed imperceptibly as those vibrations intensified. His shoulders lifted slightly as though responding to a familiar cadence. The wires along his spine tightened and relaxed in slow, sinuous movements, reacting to the tremors rather than the environment. The Confessor's torso tilted forward, as though drawn by an unseen tether his body, anticipating the coming violence with something that resembled hunger more than duty. The transport lurched violently as it came to a halt, jarring the senses. The doors began to cycle open with a grinding of metal against metal. A rush of heated air surged inside, carrying the suffocating scent of scorched oils and burned flesh. It was not the clean burn of chemical fire, nor the raw heat of molten metal. It was a hybrid, the smell of a forge moon forced to metabolize its own wounds. Ovidian stepped forward, and every head turned again. Their expressions contained no fear, only anticipation. Their bodies felt suspended between tension and longing, the border between pain and purpose blurring until indistinguishable. The Confessor descended into the hazed battlefield without hesitation. His movements lacked urgency. They possessed the deliberate calm of someone entering a place of worship rather than a war zone. The air reacted to him before the enemy did. Heat coiled around him, but he welcomed it. Scattered shrapnel pattered against his form, embedding in exposed tissue, but he carried no reaction. His suffering was a constant so complete that additional pain became indistinguishable within it. I followed him into a world shaped not by conflict, but by erosion. Machinery wheezed through malfunctioning vents. Metal frameworks trembled under unseen pressures. The ground pulsed with the exhaustion of a living system pushed past endurance. The forge moon did not resist the enemy. It resisted the Confessor's presence, as though recoiling instinctively from the magnitude of his unraveling. The soldiers accompanying us scattered into formations, but their focus remained on Avidian. The enemy became secondary, an incidental obstacle compared to the gravity of the Confessor's descent into self-annihilation. Pain radiated from him in waves, not as emotion, not as suffering, as force, as liturgy, as communion. Where he walked, the forge moon trembled. Where he paused, machinery stuttered. Where he bled, the air tasted of metal and something older. Watching him, it became clear that the battle ahead would not be defined by victory or loss. It would be shaped by the slow, relentless collapse of a man who had chosen to hollow himself in pursuit of a divine machine that might never answer. The battlefield did not announce itself through clarity, but through distortion. Shapes moved where they should not have moved, shadows thickened where machinery strained, and the air carried a density that felt closer to exhaustion than atmosphere. Nothing presented itself fully. Everything vibrated just below comprehension, as though the world hesitated to reveal what it had become under the pressures exerted by the heretics and by Avidian alike. The first clash reached me through sensation rather than sight. A tremor coursed across the ground, rising into the legs like a pulse delivered by a dying heart. It was followed by a bloom of heat that expanded unevenly, suggesting a malfunctioning reactor or weapon discharge. The Confessor did not alter his pace. The heat pressed against him and dissipated along the surface of his charred skin as though absorbed by deeper layers of ruin. The soldiers behind him braced instinctively, but their bracing had more to do with what he represented than the threat ahead. Avidian crossed the threshold, where visibility dissolved into glare. The air shimmered with particulate ash suspended in thermal drafts, creating a shifting curtain that concealed any distinct feature. My enhanced vision pierced the haze well enough, yet even augmented optics struggled to define the forms within. The distortion felt deliberate, as though the forge moon rejected the clarity that might force it to acknowledge the violence inflicted upon it. As we advanced, the sensory overload intensified. Proximity to the Confessor magnified every sensation. His body radiated heat in intermittent waves, as though some internal engine strained toward ignition. The smell of burned flesh drifted from him continuously, not as fresh injury, but as permanent exhalation. The scent blended with the metallic tang of oxidized air until differentiation became impossible. The first remnants of battle emerged gradually. Pools of liquefied metal spread across the ground in irregular patterns, cooling unevenly and forming jagged ridges. Some of the puddles still sizzled, releasing thin tendrils of steam that rose like degraded spirits. Scattered limbs, flesh, metal, and combinations of both lay among the debris. Their angles spoke of violence executed with no restraint, violence that prioritized eradication over precision. Avidian stepped among the remains with absolute calm, his footfalls pressed into the molten edges without hesitation. The heat that would have melted standard infantry boots clung to his flesh, sinking into wounds that had no opportunity to heal. His body reacted only with minor tremors, the kind that hinted at nerve endings long since overwhelmed into numbness. The soldiers fanned out behind him. Their movements held a tension born not from fear but from a form of reverence that bordered on compulsion. They watched him more intently than the shifting shadows of the enemy. Their breaths remained shallow yet unwavering. Their bodies leaned forward slightly, as though tethered to him by something stronger than command structure. They waited for the Confessor to reveal the path, not through instruction, but through the language of his suffering. The enemy revealed itself, slowly emerging from the haze like fragments of machinery awakening from torpor. They moved with sharp, erratic motions as though their limbs carried conflicting orders from corrupted machine logic. Their augmentations glowed faintly through the smoke-fractured halos that flickered in unstable patterns. Heretic silhouettes resembled parodies of human form built not for symmetry or survival, but for function executed without regard for cost. They charged with abrupt violence. The first wave reached us with surprising speed, propelled by limbs reinforced with grafted pistons and exposed servos. Their bodies emitted the mechanical shriek of metal grinding against metal. It pierced the air with a sharpness that cut directly into nerve pathways. Before weapons were raised, the Confessor moved. He advanced into the oncoming force with a slowness that defied the urgency of combat, yet every step he took radiated pressure. The air around him thickened, intensifying heat and distortion. The sensation of watching him enter the fray felt like witnessing a fracture widening in the world, an opening carved through pain rather than power. The heretics reached him first. Their limbs struck him with mechanical precision, driving jagged metal into his torso, shoulders, and arms. Sparks erupted along the points of impact. Metal tore into flesh that had already been compromised, sinking deeper with each blow. Avidian's body jerked from the force, yet he did not recoil. Instead, he pressed deeper into them, forcing their blades and tools to travel further into his tissue. The heretics reacted with confusion. Their programming sought response patterns based on expected human reactions: withdrawal, collapse, evasion. Avidian offered none. His pain did not repel, it engulfed. He moved into their attacks as though they fueled him, each wound becoming an anchor that enabled him to pull himself closer. When he reached them, the effect was immediate. Their mechanical limbs convulsed violently, servo motors misfired, hydraulic lines burst. The heat radiating from Avidian's body intensified, forcing their systems into destabilization. The smell of melting circuitry rose in thick, nauseating plumes. Their bodies spasmed under the pressure of his proximity, as though some unseen force rewrote the logic of their internal architecture. They collapsed not from the Confessor's strikes, but from their own systems, tearing themselves apart under the strain. More enemies surged forward. They attempted to surround him, forming a ring of mechanical limbs and rusted blades. Their movements synchronized with artificial precision, an imitation of unity that sought to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Avidian stepped deeper into their formation, without altering speed. The heat from his body surged higher, visible now as a faint shimmer of distorted air around him. The embedded wires along his limbs pulsed with growing intensity. His flesh darkened further, as if the heat inside him attempted to ignite from within. The heretics faltered, their formations fractured as their systems reacted to the proximity of the Confessor's radiating agony. Some staggered backward, limbs locking into rigid angles. Others froze entirely, trapped between internal commands that conflicted too violently to execute. It became clear then that Avidian did not combat them. He consumed their stability simply by approaching. He carried within him a resonance of suffering so concentrated that machinery, no matter how corrupted, struggled to endure it. His body emitted a frequency of torment that disrupted anything built to function. The soldiers finally moved around him, following through the gap created by the Confessor's mere presence. Their movements lacked elegance, driven instead by fervor. They plunged into the weakened heretics with reckless abandon, their blows fueled not by training but by the contagion of pain emanating from Avidian. Each soldier became an echo of the Confessor, in miniature bodies willingly colliding with blades, embracing wounds, pushing deeper into danger. Their blood flowed freely, staining their robes and armor with expanding patterns that resembled ritual markings. They welcomed each cut as an affirmation, each strike as an initiation. The battlefield transformed into a congregation of self-inflicted suffering, woven with the violence of combat. The screams of metal and flesh blended into a single tone that vibrated deep within the chest, creating a rhythm that felt both sickening and transcendent. I advanced through the chaos with the efficiency bred into my blood and bone. My movements carved clear paths. Bodies fell cleanly beneath my strikes, yet every impact felt muted beside the spectacle of Avidian's descent. My role here was preservation, his was obliteration. The factory's core loomed ahead, marked by a surge of heat and pressure that threatened to collapse the corridor around it. The structure groaned under the strain of its failing systems. Shapes moved within the glare. Larger heretics more heavily augmented their silhouettes, distorted by the heat washing from their internal reactors. Avidian approached them with growing instability. His body trembled with each step. His torso emitted brief bursts of orange light as wires along his spine overloaded in rapid pulses. His breathing became erratic, each inhalation shuddering through his damaged frame. Yet he continued forward, guided not by strategy but by the gravitational pull of his own unraveling. The larger heretics responded with coordinated ferocity. Their limbs swung with immense power, trailing sparks and streams of molten residue. The impacts landed against Avidian with force capable of crushing normal bone. His body bent beneath the blows, metal embedded deeper, flesh tore. Heat vented from open wounds in violent bursts. He moved forward still. The final moments of the confrontation felt less like battle and more like collision, an unstoppable force meeting several immovable objects, all of which fractured under the weight of his suffering. The heretics collapsed in rapid succession, their reactors overheated, their limbs fused, their internal systems imploded. They died not from damage inflicted by weapons, but from exposure to a form of agony their programming could not endure. Avidian stood amid their remains, trembling violently, smoke rising from his wounds, heat distorting the air around him in visible waves. He had not won, he had endured, and in enduring he had unmade everything near him. The aftermath of the first engagement did not bring clarity, it brought disorientation. The battle had dissolved into a haze of heat, metallic smoke, and lingering vibrations that clung to the inside of the skull. Even the distant rumble of the Forge Moon's failing systems felt muted, replaced by a deeper rhythm, pulsing beneath the senses, as though the environment itself had begun breathing in time with the Confessor. Avidian stood among the wreckage of ruptured heretics, his form wavering under the distortion of rising heat. He had stopped moving, but the sensation of movement still radiated from him, a faint oscillation of tension shivering through the air. His body's tremors persisted, no longer tied to impact, but originating from within him, as if some internal structure attempted to break free of its failing confinement. The soldiers gathered around him in a loose circle, their movements slow and purposeful, shaped less by fatigue than by overwhelming awe. Their wounds bled openly, yet none sought treatment. They touched their injuries with the same reverence they held for sacred relics, tracing the edges of fresh lacerations with trembling fingers. Each drop of blood falling from their torn bodies felt like a continuation of Avidian's ritual, an offering sustained even after the enemy had been reduced to steaming fragments. The air carried a thickness that resisted breathing. It pressed down with a weight that bypassed physical sensation and settled directly onto instinct. My enhanced physiology adapted, but the adaptation brought no relief. The pressure burrowed beneath the armor, constricting the organs in a slow, deliberate squeeze. It reminded me of the vacuum drills during training, where simulated atmospheres were replaced with total pressure collapse. Yet this sensation was inverted, an overabundance rather than an absence, as though reality itself leaned too heavily on this place. Avidian's state deepened the suffocation. His wounds vented faint trails of heat that spiraled upward, creating columns of distortion that swayed with each breath. The rhythms of his breathing were uneven, shifting abruptly, as if several conflicting patterns overlapped inside him. Each exhalation released a low vibration that felt more sensed than heard, a resonance that traveled through the bones and settled behind the eyes. The tremors coursing along his limbs grew more pronounced. His muscles contracted in stuttering bursts, as though pulled taut by strings manipulated by unseen hands. Where wires emerged from his flesh, the skin around them stretched beyond natural tolerance, cracking, bleeding, then searing shut beneath the heat. His body had become a collapsing monument, each section held upright, not by strength but by the refusal to fall. As he resumed movement, the surrounding space reacted with palpable tension. The ground vibrated under his steps, not from force, but from resonance. Machinery in the vicinity emitted brief pained groans, as though dragged into unwilling synchrony with him. Even the soldiers flinched, not from fear, but from the involuntary response of bodies caught between worship and horror. He continued toward the deeper corridors of the industrial complex. The soldiers followed him without command, forming a procession that resembled a pilgrimage more than a military maneuver. They moved unsteadily, their injuries accumulating with each step. Their bodies leaned into their wounds, allowing pain to shape their posture and pace. Some limped, others pressed hands to exposed bone, still others dragged themselves forward when legs buckled, yet no one slowed, no one questioned the path. The deeper we descended, the more the Forge Moon seemed to resist our presence. The air thickened with particulate matter that clung to armor and skin alike, coating every surface with a fine film of metallic grit. The light dimmed into a dull glow that offered no warmth. The machinery lining the corridors trembled intermittently, vibrating with irregular patterns that suggested internal distress rather than mechanical operation. Heat radiated from fissures in the metal walls, creating pockets of rising temperature that pressed against the senses. the heat lacked the cleansing purity of flame. It carried a corrupted quality, a simmering exhaustion, as though the moon itself was slowly cooking under the strain of its own failing lifeblood. Each breath tasted of iron-burnt oil, and the faint bitterness of something decomposing at a molecular level. Avidian thrived in the suffocating atmosphere. His movements gained an unnatural fluidity, as though the heat fed him more effectively than oxygen. His tremors grew stronger, but so did his pace. He moved with the inevitability of a pendulum long removed from its clock, swinging forward through inertia alone. The soldiers behind him struggled to maintain pace, but their suffering did not deter them. Their devotion burned hotter than their wounds. As we advanced deeper, we encountered the remnants of defensive structures abandoned in panic. Half-melted barricades leaned crookedly against walls warped by heat. Pools of liquefied metal spread across the ground, still simmering, refusing to solidify. The irregular shapes suggested a rapid collapse, defenders overwhelmed not by superior force, but by something they could not understand or endure. The heretics' corpses became more numerous. They lay sprawled in positions that conveyed neither resistance nor escape. Their limbs twisted at impossible angles, augmetics fused to the ground by heat that could not have come from conventional weaponry. Some of their bodies bore no visible external damage but had collapsed inward as though imploded by internal malfunction. Their expressions, frozen in the moment of failure, reflected confusion rather than fear. Their deaths had been abrupt, unexpected, and utterly beyond their predictive logic. The soldiers observed these scenes with growing fervor. Their eyes widened with exhilaration, their breaths deepened despite their pain, and their wounds bled more freely as they pushed themselves harder. They seemed to believe the destruction validated Avidian's sanctity, affirming that their path lay in the replication of his suffering. The battlefield became a gallery of martyrdom they sought to join. Avidian reached a central chamber where the Forge Moon's inner workings converged. The space felt alive with strain. The air pulsed with a steady vibration, as though the infrastructure attempted to expel a presence it could not comprehend. The glow from the machinery shifted erratically, fluctuating between dull red and bright white in a pattern that suggested imminent collapse. Avidian stepped into the chamber, and the environment reacted instantly. The vibration intensified, resonating through the floor and walls. The light flickered chaotically. Data conduits along the ceiling sparked showering fragments of molten insulation that fell like burning rain. The pressure in the room rose sharply, squeezing the lungs, compressing the chest, tightening the throat in silent protest. The Confessor raised his head slightly, not in acknowledgement but in response to the resonance that greeted him. The tremors in his body aligned momentarily with the vibration of the chamber, creating a harmonic that aggravated the senses. It felt as though my own bones sought to vibrate in discordant rhythm, struggling to differentiate between internal and external sensation. His limbs twitched as the wires embedded within began to pulse faster. Each pulse sent a ripple through his damaged frame, causing wounds to reopen in small fountains of blood that steamed upon contact with the heated air. His flesh writhed against the grafted metal as though attempting to break free from confinement. The air around him shimmered more violently, intensifying the distortion that surrounded his form. The soldiers gathered in the chamber with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. Their bodies swayed, guided by a rhythm they could not resist. Their wounds bled openly, dripping onto the scorched metal floor in irregular splatters that sizzled on contact. Some collapsed from blood loss and dragged themselves to their knees, refusing to lose sight of the Confessor. Avidian advanced toward the heart of the chamber, where a massive central conduit pulsed with unstable energy. The conduit emitted a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the senses like a sustained cry. The machinery shuddered beneath the strain of a system pushed to the brink of catastrophic failure. Avidian approached it without hesitation. His presence altered the conduit's rhythm. The pulses slowed momentarily, then increased in rapid bursts, as if battling conflicting instructions. The conduit's glow intensified, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the chamber, distorting proportions and bending edges. His body convulsed violently as the proximity overwhelmed his failing structure. His spine arched unnaturally, forcing the embedded wires to tighten until some snapped, releasing small bursts of sparks and molten insulation. His muscles contracted in spasms so brutal that the sound of tearing flesh echoed faintly through the chamber. Yet he continued forward. His agony had become an act of will, a ritual, a form of self-erasure through which he sought communion. The conduit responded with increasing instability. Its glow flickered violently, oscillating between brilliance and darkness as though the machinery could not decide whether to welcome or repel him. When he finally placed his hand against the conduit, the chamber collapsed into silence. Not true silence, motion, heat, vibration, all continued, but a silence of meaning, as though the narrative of the world paused to witness the merging of two collapsing things. His flesh burned instantly, yet he did not withdraw. His arm trembled as the conduit poured raw energy through him, channeling instability into instability, suffering into suffering. He did not succumb, he endured, and in enduring he began the slow unmaking of everything around him. The chamber reacted to the contact between Avidian and the conduit with a violent shift in atmosphere. Heat surged outward in a sudden wave, not the gradual rise of temperature but an explosive bloom that pressed into armor and skin with suffocating intensity. The sensation crawled across the body in a smothering shroud, thickening the air until breathing required conscious force. Even my enhanced physiology strained against the oppressive weight enveloping the space. Avidian absorbed the brunt of the energy. His body convulsed as the current surged through him, a torrent raw enough to destabilize the chamber's structural integrity. The conduits along the walls pulsed in erratic bursts, sparking with uncontrolled discharge. Each pulse traveled through the metal surfaces like a shivering echo, vibrating plates beneath my boots and rattling through the armor's internal servos in staccato spasms. The Confessor's hand fused to the conduit almost instantly. The heat welded flesh and metal together, sealing the point of contact in a grotesque bond. The grafts embedded along his arm glowed as though set ablaze from within. His skin split open in long peeling strips that curled away from the exposed muscle beneath, revealing layers of tissue blackened and blistering. The chamber filled with the acrid scent of burning flesh mixed with the sharper tang of overheated circuitry. The soldiers reacted with a collective shudder. They watched him with a mixture of terror and reverence, so intertwined that distinguishing the two became meaningless. Their bodies swayed, drawn toward him, as though caught in a gravitational field formed from his suffering. Some collapsed to their knees, overwhelmed by heat and blood loss. Others pressed forward despite the rising temperature, their breaths short, their limbs trembling, their wounds reopening through uncontrolled motion. Avidian's spine arched with increasing violence. Each convulsion dragged the grafted wires along his back, taut until they snapped one by one, releasing bursts of molten insulation that scattered across the floor like fragments of ignited resin. His body trembled with a rhythm that no longer corresponded to breath or pulse. It resembled the stuttering of machinery in its final stage of failure, where every movement was a spasm induced by collapsing systems rather than intent. The conduit's glow intensified until it became painful to look at. Light radiated in uneven pulses that forced the pupils to constrict into narrow slits. The brightness distorted the chamber's geometry, stretching shadows into elongated shapes that bent across the walls like living tendrils. The vibrations deepened, evolving from tremors into a resonant thrum that settled into the bones with a nauseating persistence. The soldiers trembled beneath the rising pressure. Their bodies leaked blood from reopened wounds, staining the scorching floor beneath them. Their chests rose and fell in erratic rhythms as they struggled for breath, yet none tried to flee. Their faces bore expressions of rapture shaped by devotion pushed to the edge of delirium. They watched Avidian as though his suffering represented the culmination of their own existence, the proof of a truth they sought but could not articulate. The energy coursing through the Confessor began to reshape him. His limbs lost their natural curvature as muscle fibers tightened under the strain of electrical overload. The outline of his form blurred within the shimmering heat, as though his body existed in two places at once, anchored by flesh, yet drawn elsewhere by a force beyond physics. His chest convulsed as ribs cracked under internal pressure, spreading apart in jagged fissures that exposed glimpses of organs boiling beneath the skin. The conduit responded to him with an escalating frenzy. Its pulses accelerated, pushing the machinery into cycles of overheating that threatened structural collapse. The chamber shook with a growing intensity. Plates along the wall buckled, bolts strained within their fixtures. Vaporized coolant vented through ruptured seams, filling the air with hissing clouds that burned the throat and eyes. The soldiers absorbed the consequences of the instability. Some collapsed from the heat, their bodies curling into themselves as though attempting to shrink from the pressure. Others leaned into their wounds, using pain to anchor themselves in the chaos. A few clawed at their own flesh in frenzied attempts to sustain clarity, tearing open old scars to release fresh blood onto the searing floor. Their devotion bound them to the Confessor, compelling them to mirror his unraveling in smaller, desperate increments. Avidian's legs buckled, but did not collapse fully. His muscles locked in rigid spasms that held him upright through sheer mechanical tension. Each tremor reverberated through the chamber, distorting the air with shimmering waves. The grafted metal along his legs heated to incandescent levels, glowing a blinding orange that illuminated the chamber in pulsating strokes. His flesh sizzled around the embedded machinery, melting into the metal as though willingly sacrificing its integrity to maintain his position. The energy within him escalated further, surpassing what the conduit's protocols could sustain. The glow expanded into a blinding halo that obscured the boundaries of his form. The sound shifted from vibration to a low-frequency roar that bypassed hearing and resonated directly against the inner organs. It felt as though the chamber had become the throat of a vast, dying beast, filling with the echo of its final breath. The soldiers responded with renewed fervor. Their breaths turned ragged, drawn through clenched teeth as the air grew nearly unbreathable. Their bodies swayed more violently. Some collapsed and dragged themselves forward, using hands slick with blood, refusing to allow distance between themselves and the Confessor. Others pressed their wounds against the searing floor, letting the heat cauterize flesh in a grotesque imitation of ritual purification. Their faces glistened with sweat and blood as they surrendered themselves wholly to the rising storm. The chamber's temperature reached a threshold where armor plates warped against my body. Internal sensors issued warnings as ambient heat approached levels capable of damaging the suit's systems. The air shimmered with such intensity that depth perception became fluid, unstable. The ground beneath me felt softening, vibrating with the imminent threat of collapse. Avidian's transformation intensified. The skin around his torso split entirely, peeling away in patches that revealed a network of exposed organs pulsating beneath a lattice of wired grafts. His heart convulsed in rapid spasms, each contraction sending waves of blood spilling down his abdomen in steaming rivulets. The heat boiled the blood upon contact with the air, filling the chamber with dense, humid vapor that tasted of iron and rot. His suffering reached a point where it no longer resembled pain in any human sense. It had transcended sensation, becoming instead a phenomenon, an eruption of agony so intense that the boundaries between flesh and machinery, man and environment, self and purpose, dissolved into a singular state of collapse. He was not enduring the energy. He was becoming part of it. The conduit began to crack. Thin fractures traced along its length, glowing white-hot at their edges. Each new fissure emitted a burst of blinding light and a surge of heat that further destabilized the chamber. The machinery surrounding the conduit emitted pained groans as systems failed in cascading patterns. Panels buckled inward, cables tore free from their housings. Sparks rained down like burning snow. The soldiers reacted with exhilaration rather than fear. Their bodies tensed in anticipation as the environment spiraled toward destruction. Their devotion had no threshold. They sought annihilation as validation, believing the Confessor's transformation heralded a revelation they longed to witness. Avidian's body detonated into a final convulsion. The energy within him surged outward, creating a shockwave of heat and pressure that blasted through the chamber. The wave struck with force that overwhelmed armor servos, drove breath from lungs and knocked bodies to the floor. The soldiers cried out silently as their bodies contorted beneath the force, limbs twisting into positions that strained tendons and broke bones. The Confessor's form flickered within the halo of light. His silhouette disintegrated piece by piece as heat consumed him. His limbs dissolved into streams of molten matter. His chest collapsed inward. His spine twisted and snapped under the strain. The last remnants of his body fused entirely with the conduit, melting into a single mass of glowing metal and charred tissue. The chamber held its breath for one final moment. Then the conduit ruptured. Heat exploded outward in a blinding eruption that drowned all sensation. Pressure surged through the chamber, flattening everything in its path, reducing metal and flesh to indistinguishable wreckage. Light consumed the world in a single, overwhelming flash that seemed to erase shape and time itself. And within that consuming flare, the echo of Avidian's suffering lingered, an imprint burned into the senses, a resonance carved into the marrow, a ghost of agony that would never fully fade. The eruption from the conduit did not end as a single blast. It expanded outward in a series of pulses, each one weaker than the last, yet sharper in sensation, like the aftershocks of a dying star trying to reassert a presence already fading. The heat wave had been the first strike, unquestionable, overwhelming, absolute, but what followed reached deeper, pressing into the marrow with a vibrating resonance that felt less like physical force and more like a memory branded onto bone. When I regained clarity, the chamber no longer resembled a place of machinery. It resembled a wound torn open in the Forge Moon's infrastructure, a cavern of exposed metal veins and collapsed scaffolding. Yet even that description felt inadequate. Nothing held a consistent shape. The air wavered with residual heat, bending lines of sight into distorted arcs. Surfaces pulsed intermittently as though struggling to reclaim stability after being bent past their limits. The soldiers lay scattered across the chamber floor in positions that reflected the violence of the blast. Twisted limbs, contorted spines, bodies half buried under fallen debris. Many did not move. The smell of burned cloth, scorched flesh, and melted augmetics clung to the air with suffocating persistence. My visor filtered the worst of it, but the scent infiltrated regardless, seeping into the suit's interior with a sickly warmth that coated the inside of the throat. Some soldiers still breathed. Their breaths were shallow, rattling, strained. They attempted to rise but lacked the strength to lift their bodies. Their limbs trembled with each attempt, muscles refusing to respond to commands shaped by will rather than capacity. Their eyes stared ahead, as though searching for direction in the lingering glow that clung to the chamber. Their devotion had survived, but their bodies had not. The space where Avidian had stood no longer held anything resembling a human silhouette. Instead, the remains of the conduit glowed in a dull, unstable pulse, as though struggling to process what had been forced into it. The fused mass of metal and flesh that had once been the Confessor clung to its surface like a charred scar, still steaming, still softening around the edges. The heat radiating from the fusion point felt different, now less like fire and more like grief, a slow exhalation of energy that carried no violence, only exhaustion. The chamber's ambient temperature remained brutally high. Breathing required deliberate effort, forcing air into lungs that protested with each inhalation. Sweat mixed with the dust and grime that coated my armor's interior, creating a suffocating humidity that clung to skin like a second unwanted layer. My gene-enhanced physiology kept me functional, but functionality no longer equated to comfort. The environment gnawed at strength piece by piece, demanding constant adjustment. Erratic vibrations traveled through the floor, rising in irregular pulses that reverberated upward along the legs. They felt like the Forge Moon's faltering breaths, shallow, uncertain, threatened by collapse. The instability induced a subtle dizziness, as though the world beneath me lacked the conviction to remain solid. I anchored my stance, forcing my body to resist the rhythmic sway. It was then I noticed movement among the fallen soldiers. One dragged herself forward, using only her arms, her legs hanging useless behind her, twisted at unnatural angles. Her armor had melted along one side, revealing skin blistered and peeling. She watched the fused remains of the Confessor with an expression that might have been awe or despair. She reached out a trembling hand toward the molten mass, stopping only when heat forced her back. Her fingers curled in frustration, her breath hitching in short, broken intervals. Another soldier pressed her forehead against the burning floor, letting the heat sear into her skin. The gesture carried no hint of purpose beyond surrender. Her body shook with rapid, uncontrolled tremors as her wounds reopened beneath the strain. Blood pooled beneath her, steaming upon contact with the scorched metal. She sank further into the posture until her movements stilled entirely. Others attempted to rise only to collapse again. They were not resisting pain. They were seeking it, clinging to it, trying to fill the void left by Avidian's annihilation. His suffering had been their compass, and without it they drifted. Their bodies, though ruined, yearned for continuation of the ritual they had witnessed. They had no leader now, only echoes. The chamber responded to their desperation with cold indifference. Residual heat radiated from the ruptured conduit, offering no comfort, no guidance, only a reminder of the violence that had hollowed the space. Sparks flickered intermittently from exposed wiring along the ceiling, descending in faint streams like dying stars. Each spark carried a faint crackle that bounced through the chamber, reminding the survivors that the world around them still resisted stability. I moved through the wreckage with deliberate care. My armor's servos responded sluggishly under the oppressive heat, each movement accompanied by a faint grind. The reinforced plating along my limbs had absorbed the worst of the blast, but the suit's internal diagnostics hammered my vision with warnings. Heat thresholds exceeded. Structural strain rising. Oxygen reserve taxed by atmospheric contamination. Yet my mind remained clear, not because clarity came easily, but because the situation demanded it. Reaching the Confessor's remains felt both instinctive and revolting. I stepped closer to the fused mass, sensing the heat intensify in a rising gradient. The air shimmered more violently near the fusion point, distorting the outlines of the central machinery. The mass itself pulsed faintly, an irregular throb that suggested energy still moved through it, residue, not life. The shape bore no resemblance to a man anymore. His body had dissolved into the conduit, leaving behind only fragments embedded in the cooling metal. A twisted rib-scorched tissue fused with steel, a charred spinal segment partially visible beneath a layer of molten alloy. Each fragment felt like an accusation preserved in heat. As the vibrations subsided, silence settled over the chamber, an oppressive stillness shaped by the absence of the Confessor's presence. The soldiers, deprived of the resonance that had guided them, lay scattered in postures of devotion, frozen into futility. Their breaths grew faint, some fading entirely as their bodies succumbed to the damage inflicted by the blast and their own obsession. Time stretched into a slow descent. The heat lingered, refusing to dissipate. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, pressing down with a palpable weight that settled across shoulders and spine. The lights flickered at irregular intervals, illuminating the chamber in erratic flashes that revealed the wreckage in shifting, fragmented glimpses. As I stood among the ruin, the realization settled with cold clarity. The Confessor had not simply died. He had given himself so completely to suffering that the boundary between his body and the machine had dissolved. His annihilation had been an act of devotion carried beyond all limits, leaving nothing behind but residue, material and spiritual. And his followers, shaped by the gravitational force of his martyrdom, were left hollow. Their bodies trembled with the remnants of the ritual, but their purpose had evaporated in the heat. Without his suffering to guide them, they remained trapped in postures of longing, unable to rise, unable to let go. The chamber felt like the aftermath of a prayer so powerful it had broken the world around it. The air still hummed with its echo, fragile yet persistent. Avidian's final act had left a scar not only upon the structure, but upon the psyche of every survivor. The emptiness he left behind bore weight heavier than his presence. The forge moon reacted with a slow, mournful shudder. The vibrations beneath my feet deepened, traveling upward into my armor in a steady, oppressive rhythm. Somewhere deep within the machinery system struggled to recover from the overload. The entire structure felt weaker, more vulnerable, as though the ritual had drained not only the conduit, but the moon's very essence. I turned from the fused mass and surveyed the soldiers one final time. Their devotion had transformed into inertia. Some stared at the glowing residue, unblinking. Others curled around their wounds as though wombed in their own diminishing pain. A few crawled weakly toward the site of the explosion, seeking proximity to the moment that had shattered their purpose. None would rise again with conviction. The battle had ended, but no one had won. The Confessor had broken the enemy and his own followers in the process. All that remained was the echo of a devotion too powerful to contain itself, and the lingering heat of a man who had burned himself into nothingness. The path out of the ruptured chamber unfolded in a haze of shifting heat and distorted perception. The metal beneath my boots had softened under the force of the blast, sinking slightly with each step. It felt less like walking across a floor and more like traversing the cooling surface of a fresh wound. The Forge Moon's structure trembled intermittently, not with violent quakes, but with slow, exhausted pulses that radiated through the corridors, like the heartbeat of a dying organism. The air retained a heavy metallic density. Each breath traveled through the throat with a scraping texture, carrying particles fine enough to evade filtration systems. They clung to the insides of lungs with a faint burning sensation that grew more noticeable with each inhale. Sweat gathered beneath the armor, mixing with dust and heat, to form an uncomfortable layer that adhered to the skin in damp, suffocating patches. The soldiers who had survived the explosion remained scattered throughout the corridor. Their bodies formed a trail of devotion carved in pain, each position revealing the moment their strength had finally failed. Some lay curled against the walls, arms wrapped around their torsos, as though trying to contain the remnants of purpose within collapsing bodies. Others sprawled prone, limbs twisted by the violence of the blast and their own frenzied attempts to rise afterward. A few still clung to consciousness. They clawed weakly at the floor, dragging themselves forward by inches. Their movements carried no tactical intention. They crawled out of instinct, not direction, eyes unfocused and breaths ragged. Their wounds leaked steadily, leaving streaks of blood that steamed upon contact with the overheated metal. Each dragging gesture looked less like progress and more like a final involuntary surrender to inertia. Their devotion persisted even as their bodies failed. It radiated from them in the way their fingers curled toward the direction of the chamber behind us, as though longing for the presence that had annihilated itself. They sought connection to a suffering that no longer existed, reaching for echoes of agony that had dissipated into the Forge Moon's trembling infrastructure. I stepped around them with deliberate care, not out of reverence but necessity. Their bodies twitched unpredictably. Muscles spasmed under the strain of internal damage, causing sudden jerks that risked pulling them into my path. Even unconscious, their nervous systems responded to lingering echoes of what they had witnessed. Their devotion had embedded itself so deeply that even the body's involuntary motions reflected desperate yearning. The corridor ahead narrowed into a stretch of buckled plating and warped supports. Sections of the ceiling drooped lower than intended, bent by the chamber's shockwave. The structure emitted occasional pops as metal strained under uneven stress. These sounds echoed faintly, creating the impression of distant movement that never fully materialized. The Forge Moon had become a labyrinth of collapsing tension, each new sound raising the possibility of further instability. A wave of dizziness washed over me as I progressed. The heat and lack of airflow conspired to create a growing sense of suffocation. My enhanced physiology resisted, but even resilience had limits. Vision narrowed slightly, edges blurring before sharpening again. The armor's internal regulation systems worked against the environment, but the balance grew tenuous with each passing minute. I passed a cluster of survivors collapsed together in a heap. Their bodies leaned against one another for support that none could provide. Their armor had melted into irregular shapes, fusing to patches of exposed skin. They had attempted to rise as a group, judging by the positions of their limbs and the smeared lines of blood leading upward, but their injuries had denied them. Now they rested in a state suspended between consciousness and oblivion, breaths, shallow bodies trembling intermittently as nerve endings misfired. Their eyes, where open, bore the glassy sheen of spiritual dislocation. Whatever center of faith had guided them had collapsed with the Confessor's body, leaving them hollow. Their devotion remained as an instinct rather than conviction, a reflex without direction. They existed in a liminal state, caught between the desire to rise and the capacity to remain alive. Several meters ahead, a soldier clung to a pipe protruding from the wall. Her fingers dug into the metal until skin tore, leaving streaks of blood down the corroded surface. She held herself upright through will alone, though her legs provided no support. The tendons in her neck stood out sharply, trembling with the strain of keeping her head lifted. Her chest rose in shallow, rattling motions. She remained fixed on something far behind us, perhaps the last glow of Ovidion's fused remains, perhaps only the memory of his suffering. When her strength finally failed, She slid downward in a slow, silent collapse, leaving a dark smear along the pipe before crumpling into a motionless heap. The forge moon exhaled another shudder. This one was deeper, resonating through the supports with a low vibration that unsettled the balance of the passage. Dust dislodged from above, drifting in slow arcs through the fluctuating heat. The air thickened further, carrying the taste of rust-burned insulation and something raw and organic beneath the metallic veneer. I continued forward, allowing instinct and training to dictate each movement. My strides remained steady despite the environment's mounting resistance. The servos within the armor strained audibly, their hum deepening with each step. The internal temperature warnings grew more frequent. Every indicator suggested that remaining within this collapsing structure for much longer would test even my genetically engineered endurance. Yet the path continued to unfold before me, pulling me deeper into the forge moon's interior. The corridors twisted with increasing irregularity as though reshaped by the explosion's aftermath. The structural integrity fluctuated. Some sections trembled violently beneath the weight of unseen forces, while others remained eerily still, suspended in tense anticipation. The oppressive silence that followed Ovidian's demise did not ease as distance grew. It thickened, expanding like a fog of absence. The void left behind by his suffering did not dissipate. It spread. Each step carried me further into a realm that felt spiritually stripped, hollowed out. The air lacked resonance. The walls lacked breath. The environment felt emptied of something intangible yet vital. Ahead, faint traces of movement flickered at the edge of perception. My vision adjusted, cycling through filters to compensate for the shifting light. Shapes appeared briefly, shadows passing behind fallen supports or silhouettes drifting between pools of heat distortion. Each shape vanished before resolution. Whether remnants of surviving heretics, illusions born from exhaustion, or environmental anomalies created by residual energy, the uncertainty imposed pressure on instinct. Sensory input heightened in response. Sounds grew sharper. Heat pulses became more articulated. The vibrations beneath the floor differentiated into layers, some deep and steady, others jittering unpredictably. The forge moon spoke in a fractured language of failing machinery and collapsing tension. The trail of survivors continued for a time, thinning gradually as the corridor stretched onward. Their bodies marked stages of devotion's collapse, those who attempted to crawl, those who attempted to stand, those who attempted to cling to the walls, those who simply fell and did not rise again. Each position revealed a story of diminishing purpose, their final acts shaped not by strategy or fear, but by loyalty to suffering. Eventually, even these remnants fell away. The corridor ahead shifted into a broader passage where the air grew cooler, not by true cooling but by retreat from the epicenter's heat. My lungs expanded more easily. The oppressive suffocation eased, though not entirely. The environment's hostility remained, but its pressure receded enough to allow fuller breaths. The stillness here carried a different weight, not the suffocation of heat, but the emptiness left behind. The silence felt cavernous, as though the forge moon itself listened for something that would never return. The absence of suffering created a void more suffocating than the temperature had been. Pain had been the anchor of this place, and without it the world drifted. I paused at the threshold of a collapsed platform extending into a deeper manufacturing sector. The metal supports had twisted under stress, creating slopes and ridges that resembled the ribs of a dying creature. Steam escaped through ruptured pipes in uneven bursts, forming clouds that drifted sluggishly before dissipating into the dimness. The platform felt like the midpoint between destruction and revelation, a place balanced precariously between what had been consumed and what remained. Standing there, the realization settled with cold clarity. The Confessor's annihilation had not ended the threat. It had created a vacuum. Pain had filled the forge moon. Now absence filled it. Where devotion had burned, emptiness spread. The destruction behind me had carved open a spiritual cavity, a void that could spread through the survivors, through the structure, through the entire campaign. Ovidian's suffering had anchored these corridors. His martyrdom had stabilized purpose. Without him, the forge moon's spiritual gravity inverted. I remained standing in the settling quiet, feeling the weight of the void ahead. Not an ending, a collapse awaiting its next descent. The descent into the lower manufacturing sector began with a subtle shift in gravity that felt less like a mechanical malfunction and more like a change in intention. The air grew denser, pressing closer to the skin with a weight that made each movement slower, more deliberate. Heat still lingered in faint currents drifting upward from the levels below, but it did not overwhelm. Instead, it carried the memory of the explosion behind me, a reminder that the world through which I walked had been shaped by suffering so intense it left an imprint on the atmosphere itself. The stairs and platforms that spiraled downward warped slightly under my weight, their supports twisted from stress, fractures invisible at first, but felt through faint vibrations. Each step produced a muted groan from the structure, as though it protested the necessity of bearing weight again so soon after enduring catastrophe. The descent felt like entering a body still in shock, muscles trembling involuntarily beneath the pressure of trauma. Light flickered along the walls in irregular pulses. Some fixtures glowed faintly, struggling to maintain coherence. Others produced erratic bursts that created brief, sharp contrasts of shadow and illumination. These bursts carved sudden silhouettes along the metal surfaces, angular forms that appeared to move until the light shifted again and revealed their stillness. The interplay between shadow and form created an unease that lingered with every downward glance. The air adopted a faint hum. It traveled through the vents and broken conduits in long, wavering currents. The sound did not resemble machinery functioning, but machinery grieving. The tones rose and fell unpredictably, creating a subtle resonance that pressed into the skull, vibrating behind the eyes with a frequency that evoked dizziness more than sound. The sensation made the world feel fragile, as though the environment had grown porous, and the boundary between perception and illusion had thinned. The path widened at intervals into platforms layered with dust and debris. Footprints marked some surfaces, not mine, not the soldiers'. The patterns were inconsistent. Some impressions appeared crisp, indicating recent passage. Others blurred at the edges, softened by drifting dust and disrupted airflow. The spacing suggested uneven gait. Whether human or augmented, the gait held a halting quality that indicated instability or confusion rather than tactical intent. The deeper I descended, the more the Forge Moon resembled the aftermath of spiritual abandonment. The structures appeared intact at a distance, but up close they held fractures not entirely physical. Supports bent awkwardly, as though subjected to forces beyond simple pressure. Surfaces bore streaks of discoloration that did not correspond to heat or oxidation patterns. Some panels rippled subtly as though reacting to stimuli too faint for my senses to register. It felt as though the machinery mourned something it could not articulate. Avidian's presence had pressed itself onto this place not through conquest or command, but through the sheer intensity of his dissolution. His suffering had become a vibration that traveled through metal and circuitry, shaping the environment into an echo of his final moments. Now that he was gone, the echo lingered with a disquieting emptiness. The corridor narrowed unexpectedly, forcing a shift in posture as overhead beams sloped downward at awkward angles. Dust thickened in the air, floating in slow drifting spirals. The particles clung to the armor's joints, gathering in crevices with increasing density. With each breath, the taste of metal and grit coated the tongue more heavily, leaving behind a dryness that intensified thirst, despite hydration systems compensating. Further down, the temperature dropped abruptly. The shift felt unnatural, occurring not through gradual decline, but through the sudden absence of heat. The coolness pressed against the exposed portions of my face beneath the helmet's seals, a brief reprieve that carried with it a sense of wrongness. The cooling was not stabilization, it was collapse, the heat dispersing into hollow spaces where pressure should have remained. The air grew thin in patches, as though currents had been redirected through ruptured conduits. Breathing became irregular in these pockets. Each inhale required more effort, drawing in less oxygen than expected. Vision sharpened narrowly, edges tightening. The environment seemed to constrict around the lungs, compressing breath into shallow intervals. As I advanced, faint shapes emerged through the haze. Twisted forms lay scattered along the floor, metal fused with flesh in configurations that no longer resembled bodies. They had been too close to Avidian's blast, or had encountered it indirectly through structural conduits. Their limbs had elongated in unnatural arcs where metal and bone had melted together before cooling into grotesque rigidity. Their torsos retained the imprint of violence so intense it had frozen their suffering into physical sculpture. Some had tried to flee. Their claw marks scored the ground, deep trenches gouged into the metal surface. The trails ended abruptly where bodies had collapsed mid-sprint, their legs fused to the floor by molten residue. The sight held no victory, only residue evidence of beings caught in a moment so overwhelming they had no time to understand their death. The corridor twisted sharply. A faint tremor ran through the floor, subtle yet persistent. It vibrated upward through the armor into the bones, a reminder that the Forge Moon's inner workings continued to destabilize. The deeper levels responded to instability with a delayed reaction that hinted at systems straining to compensate. The passage opened into a wide manufacturing hall. The space felt cavernous, its ceiling lost in a haze of dust and drifting vapor. Machinery stood in long rows, silent and cold. Conveyor belts sagged under their own weight, their surfaces coated in soot and melted fragments. The silence in this place was heavier than the air, a palpable absence that created the impression of holding one's breath. The hall bore the residue of recent movement. Footprints, some deep, some shallow, crossed the floor. They overlapped in chaotic patterns. Trails of smeared blood curved between broken machines. Marks of bodies dragged themselves across metal surfaces. None of these paths led to order or escape. They circled, doubled back, dead-ended against collapsed supports or melted doors. The survivors had wandered here after the explosion, not out of purpose but out of instinct, weakened by trauma and devotion, stripped of direction. They had moved until their bodies failed. The hall held them now as remnants of collapse, each position reflecting a final attempt to reconcile the absence of their anchor. Many lay slumped over machinery. Their hands grasped rusted components, as though seeking structure in the cold metal. Their armor bore melted rivulets and soot stains. Their faces revealed no fear, only emptiness. Eyes open, unfocused, reflecting the broken lights flickering overhead. Others had huddled in groups, their bodies leaning against each other in a futile effort at cohesion. Their breaths had slowed until stopping entirely. Their wounds told stories of attempts to rise, attempts to crawl, attempts to replicate Ovidian's suffering in their final moments. Their devotion had guided them into a spiral without a center. The Forge Moon's trembling deepened. The vibrations rippled through the hall, nudging bodies slightly. Dust shook loose from overhead beams, drifting downward in slow cascades. A faint groan echoed from somewhere in the distance, a structural lament, long and exhausted. The energy that had once radiated from Ovidian's final act lingered in this chamber like a residue. The air shimmered faintly in places where heat had warped the atmosphere. The walls retained ghost impressions of light, subtle discolorations marking the direction of the blast's resonance. The machines held faint warmth beneath their cold surfaces, as though the dying echoes of suffering had seeped into their inner components and left them trembling long after silence fell. I moved deeper into the hall, stepping around bodies frozen in states of collapse. The atmosphere thickened with spiritual detritus, a pressure without source, a sensation that leached into the skin like cold seeping through armor. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence. Each impact reverberated through the machines, returning in faint hollow tremors. The absence of purpose filled the hall in suffocating waves. Devotion had imploded here. Faith had reached a climax so catastrophic that nothing remained to sustain these bodies once the center had vanished. The survivors had not been defeated. They had simply expired in the vacuum left behind. As I reached the far end of the hall, the Forge Moon trembled again, deeper, longer, with a resonance that suggested the lower levels teetering on the edge of structural collapse. The vibrations unsettled the air, stirring dust into shifting spirals. The machines rattled faintly, shaking off layers of ash in thin sheets. The hall felt like the final chamber of a tomb carved in heat and devotion. Every surface held the memory of collapse. Every shadow held the residue of something that had once been alive with purpose, but now drifted without anchor. The descent had not ended, it had only reached its quietest point. The silence pressed against me as though waiting for something to break it. Not a survivor, not an enemy. Something deeper, something that suffering had awakened, something that absence had fed. The path beyond the manufacturing hall narrowed into a corridor almost too constricted for armored passage. It drew inward like a throat tightening with dread. The walls curved subtly, bending the line of sight and creating the sensation of being funneled towards something unseen yet expectant. The air thickened in a way that resisted inhalation, clinging against filters with a density that felt almost organic. Each breath dragged inward reluctantly, refusing to ease the dryness, accumulating behind the tongue. The metal beneath my boots softened into a different texture, still solid but with an elasticity that betrayed underlying distortion. The floor had absorbed too much heat too quickly, and now warped under the faintest pressure. The sensation resembled walking on a surface, still cooling from a wound carved into its structure. Small indentations appeared with each step, before rebounding slowly as I moved forward, leaving the disturbing impression of a living surface reacting to contact. Faint vibrations passed through the corridor at irregular intervals. They did not follow the mechanical rhythm of engines or the structural pulse of stabilizers. Instead, they resembled distant shudders, low-frequency tremors that traveled along the walls before dissipating into the stale air. Each tremor arrived without warning, unsettling muscles with its unpredictability, causing involuntary tension to gather along the spine. The temperature changed again, but not consistently. It fluctuated between faint warmth and abrupt cold, creating pockets of discomfort that required constant adaptation. Moving forward became an exercise in endurance rather than progression. The corridor did not simply lead downward, it constricted around the senses, narrowing perception until only the immediate environment remained, hollowing tunnel vision into a space that felt more psychological than physical. The deeper I entered, the more the remnants of the Iron Confederate's presence became apparent. Scorch marks crossed the walls in erratic strokes, some fresh enough that the edges still held faint discoloration from recent combustion. Scratches and gouges marred the surfaces where armored hands had dragged along the metal for balance or out of desperation. The patterns lacked cohesion, they spiraled, doubled back, and intersected in ways that suggested confusion or panic rather than tactical retreat. Bullet impacts peppered the walls in sporadic clusters. Melted sections revealed where plasma or thermal discharge had collided with the structure. Most telling were the handprints, darkened impressions where soot, blood, or ash had been transferred from gauntlets to metal. Some were small, some impossibly large, all of them pressed into the walls, as though seeking guidance in the darkness and finding none. The corridor sloped downward unexpectedly. The incline was steep enough that momentum shifted uncomfortably, forcing adjustments in posture to maintain balance. At the base of the slope, a wider chamber emerged, a long, narrow staging bay lined with dormant cargo rails. Empty loading harnesses dangled overhead, swaying slightly in the still air. Their hooks hung at uneven angles, casting stretched shadows against the walls that resembled elongated limbs reaching for something lost. The atmosphere in the bay felt heavier than in the previous hall. The emptiness carried a resonance that filled the chest with a pressure difficult to ignore. The sensation intensified with each step, seeping through armor, plating into skin and bone. It did not resemble fear exactly, nor anticipation. It felt more like standing beneath a sky waiting to collapse. Scattered along the floor lay bodies twisted into postures of desperate motion. They had fallen mid-stride, mid-turn, mid-crawl, their limbs extended toward exits they had not reached. Armor panels bore distortion from heat or force that had struck them from unpredictable angles. Their visors, cracked or shattered, reflected faint light with a milky sheen that gave the impression of eyes still open beneath. As I moved through the bay, the silence amplified the weight of their presence. The stillness was not peaceful. It pressed downward, creating an oppressive atmosphere that left no room for thought beyond the immediate sensation of being watched by what no longer lived. The bodies formed a corridor of their own, one constructed from collapse and unfinished flight. The air changed again at the far end of the bay. A faint metallic tang drifted inward, sharper than blood, heavier than machine oil. It carried a density that thickened saliva instinctively. Each inhale brought with it a sensation of particles clinging to the throat, coating it with something that felt granular and bitter. The scent deepened with proximity to a large vertical shaft that dominated the end of the chamber. The shaft descended into blackness without visible bottom. A faint draft rose from below, cold, slow, and unnatural. The air emerging from the shaft carried with it a silence so profound it resembled suffocation. Drawing near the edge triggered a primal tension in the muscles of the back and legs, as though every instinct understood that leaning too far would invite an unseen force to pull downward. Rusted maintenance ladders ran along the interior of the shaft, their rungs bent or missing entirely in some sections. Lower segments vanished into darkness so absolute that even enhanced optics returned no meaningful data. The shaft felt less like an industrial structure and more like a wound carved into the heart of the forge moon. Descending into it became inevitable. The first rung groaned beneath my weight. The vibration traveled up the ladder into the wall and then into the air itself. The echo did not dissipate immediately. It lingered, resonating in a low, wavering hum that felt wrong in its persistence. Each subsequent step produced its own groan, adding layers to a growing chorus of fragile metal protesting descent. The air thickened, the deeper I climbed. It pressed inward like water pressure, compressing the lungs slightly and slowing each inhale. The temperature dropped further until the cold began to seep through armor joints, settling into exposed areas like the slow advance of frost. Condensation formed on the interior of my visor, faint and quickly cleared by automated systems, but the moisture left behind a sensation of humidity inconsistent with the cold. The shaft walls flickered with faint luminescence, residual heat trails still embedded in the metal. They pulsed intermittently, creating the illusion of movement far below. The deeper levels of the forge moon quivered under intermittent structural shifts. The vibrations traveled upward through the ladder, delivering bursts of unsteady motion that forced a pause before each handhold. The structure felt moments away from collapse. After what felt like an extended descent measured in heartbeats rather than distance, the shaft opened into another level. A narrow platform extended from the wall, covered in debris and dust. The air here felt heavier still, but no longer cold. Heat radiated outward in sluggish pulses, as though the environment exhaled warmth at irregular intervals. Each pulse carried the faintest scent of scorched metal mixed with something organic enough to unsettle. Stepping onto the platform triggered a shallow echo that traveled down the corridor ahead. The echo did not return naturally. It fractured midway, splitting into uneven reverberations that did not match the original sound. The effect resembled a voice struggling to remember how to answer a distortion of acoustics that wrapped itself around the surrounding metal. The corridor here differed from those above. The walls curved subtly, not through architectural design but through heat distortion. Surfaces bowed inward or outward with irregularity. Some sections bulged as though something had pressed against them from within. Others collapsed inward, bearing imprints of impact or pressure that lacked clear origin. The overall effect created an uneven tunnel that forced constant adjustments to movement. The deeper the passage wound, the more disorienting the environment became. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending with each flicker of dim light. The air warped in subtle waves where heat pockets drifted unpredictably. Each step forward required conscious effort to maintain orientation amid shifting sensory cues. The walls bore marks of something that had traveled through here recently. Long scorched trails curved along the metal surface. Circular indentations pitted the ground, spaced unevenly. Every sign pointed to motion that lacked rhythm, something moving not with footsteps, but with bursts of erratic propulsion or impact. The corridor eventually widened into a chamber marked by collapse. Support beams had twisted beneath extreme stress, sagging downward until they formed bent columns of metal that resembled the ribs of a colossal carcass. The ground was uneven, fractured into plates that lifted at angles or sank under weight. The chamber's center held a crater melted deep into the floor, a depression where intense heat had pooled long enough to liquefy metal. The stillness here felt absolute. Not silent, silence suggested emptiness. This was the stillness of aftermath, of pressure withheld, of something waiting to happen again. The air bore residual tension that settled into the skin with the sensation of static before lightning. Every breath tasted faintly metallic, as though inhaling the remnants of something that had burned too hot for too long. Near the crater's edge lay more bodies fused into the floor, frozen in contorted positions that revealed the finality of their last moments. Their armor had partially liquefied, merging with the metal beneath them. Their limbs extended outward, fingers clawing at nothing. Heat had erased their identities and left behind only the impression of sudden collapse. Standing at the crater's rim revealed its depth, an unnatural gouge carved into the moon's structure, the edges smooth, where metal had melted, then hardened again. At the bottom, faint luminescence pulsed irregularly, casting shifting patterns of light across the crater walls. The glow did not resemble machinery. It pulsed with a rhythm that grew subtly faster whenever breath drew in. The sensation of being watched returned not through sight, but through the skin. Pressure gathered behind the ribs, spreading outward in waves that mimicked heartbeat patterns not my own. The air vibrated faintly, responding to something below. The pulse grew stronger, with proximity drawing attention downward in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like gravitational pull. Whatever lingered in the depths of the crater did not move, but it breathed. The crater exhaled faint waves of warmth that rolled upward in slow, rhythmic pulses. Each pulse pressed against the armor with a sensation more organic than mechanical, as though the forge moon itself had begun to mimic respiration. The air thickened with a presence that clung to the lungs and settled beneath the sternum, creating a pressure that deepened steadily with every step closer to the edge. The crater's glow throbbed in a pattern that did not align with machinery or natural heat distribution. It carried cadence, intention, memory. The descent began at the shallowest point, where the crater wall sloped into a narrow ledge. The metal here had cooled unevenly, forming ripples and waves that forced careful navigation. Each footfall produced faint creaks that disappeared instantly beneath the heavier sound of another pulse rising from the depths. The deeper I moved into the crater, the more those pulses synchronized with the beating of my own heart, aligning until the distinction between internal rhythm and external vibration blurred. A faint mist drifted near the mid-depths. It clung low to the ground, curling around the boots with delicate tendrils before dissipating into the air. The mist carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the metallic cold above. It smelled faintly of scorched copper and oxidized steel, a scent intertwined with something that resembled the aftertaste of grief. Breathing it produced a heaviness behind the eyes, a growing awareness of something formless watching from very near. The base of the crater came into view, gradually revealed through shifts in luminous haze. The surface was smooth in some places, sharp in others, as though heat had melted and reformed the metal in competing patterns of violence and restraint. The ground bore embedded impressions of armor plates fused directly into the surface, some flattened beneath pressure, some contorted into unnatural shapes by intense heat. What remained of the iron Confederates had become part of the crater floor, integrated into a tapestry of collapse. At the center of the crater lay the source of the pulsing glow. It did not resemble a body nor a machine nor any object shaped by hands. It appeared instead as a mass of twisted metal and scorched fragments drawn inward into a single locus, an imprint of Avidian's final act condensed into physical form. The remains were not arranged with symmetry or coherence. They radiated outward in a burst pattern frozen at the moment of violent creation, yet the mass still breathed, not through visible movement, but through the pulsing light that emanated from within. The glow deepened in color the closer I came, shifting from faint amber to intense crimson. Each pulse brightened briefly before fading, the rhythm becoming more insistent, more aligned with the heartbeat in my chest. The sensation created an unsettling fusion of internal and external awareness. It felt as though the crater recognized the presence of another living body and sought to draw breath from it. Standing near the centerpiece of the crater made the air feel heavier than anywhere else on the forge moon. The pressure settled onto the shoulders like weighted hands pressing inward until posture adjusted involuntarily. The ground beneath vibrated with subtle tremors that traveled up through the boots into the bones. The mass itself radiated a faint heat that carried not warmth but fatigue, an exhaustion so profound it seeped into the muscles simply by proximity. The glow brightened again, and the pulses shifted. They became slower, deeper, almost mournful. The rhythm carried resonance that traveled through the chest, vibrating against the sternum in long-drawn waves. The sensation resembled standing near a massive engine, struggling to restart after catastrophic failure. Yet there was no mechanical sound, only vibration, only breath, only a faint echo of suffering that had not fully released its hold on the metal. The remains of Avidian's presence, what little of him the blast had not destroyed, lingered within this mass, not as a consciousness, not as life, but as impression. Devotion pushed to the brink, and then past it had etched itself into the metal with a force that defied dissipation. The crater floor radiated the echo of a will that had burnt itself out. Being near it felt like standing at the edge of a void carved from agony so total that it had become stillness. The structure above trembled suddenly. Dust cascaded from the crater walls in thin sheets. Vibrations rippled through the ground in uneven pulses, competing with the deeper rhythm rising from the mass at the center. For a moment, the two rhythms collided, one representing structural collapse, the other the last breath of a devotion that refused to die even in annihilation. The discordant patterns sent a shiver through the crater, rattling metal until it rang with a chorus of dull, hollow notes. The glow flickered. The pulse slowed dramatically. A chill swept through the air as the warmth receded, leaving behind a coldness that felt like the absence of something once immense. The mass at the center contracted slightly, not through movement, but through a shift in its illumination. The light dimmed to a faded ember, then flared weakly, then dimmed again, each intermittent pulse carrying less strength than the last. The crater exhaled a final wave of warmth, followed by a silence deeper than any that had preceded it. The breathing stopped. What remained was stillness, so absolute it resembled the void between stars. The air no longer vibrated, the metal beneath no longer pulsed. The glow faded to a faint residue that drifted through cracks in the fused metal like dying embers scattered in ash. A faint sweetness entered the air, not from decay, not from heat, but from release. The weight pressing down on the chest loosened slightly, allowing breath to deepen in a way it had not since entering the crater. The forge moon trembled again, more violently than before. The crater walls groaned under the strain, sending fractures slithering across their surfaces. Plates shifted beneath the feet with jarring suddenness, forcing a brace against the uneven ground. Dust clouds erupted in brief plumes. The atmosphere shook under the stress of an infrastructure pushed to its limits. Leaving the crater required moving quickly along the warped ledges. Each step dislodged fragments of metal that tumbled down behind, clattering against the floor with sharp, irregular impacts. The walls trembled with increasing frequency, groaning as stabilizers deep below failed one after another. A rising hum began to fill the corridor above, an echo of machinery collapsing under strain too great to endure. Reaching the corridor triggered another shift in the environment. The walls here shuddered with internal vibrations, as though invisible mechanisms struggled to maintain cohesion. The scent of overheating circuitry filled the air. Lights flickered in rapid sequences, casting disorienting bursts of illumination that stretched shadows across the uneven passage. The forge moon felt as though it was falling inward upon itself, consumed by the vacuum left behind by the Iron Confessor's annihilation. As the ascent continued, the tremors intensified. Metal groaned beneath increasing pressure. The air thickened with the taste of dust and scorched wiring. Each level ascended carried the sensation of the structure sagging inward, collapsing under the cumulative weight of trauma imprinted on its core. The closer I came to the upper levels, the more the tremors transformed into a single continuous vibration, a prolonged death rattle echoing through the moon's foundation. The final climb into the upper corridors brought the atmosphere of a dying world. The walls bulged inward in places, warped outward in others. Floors rippled under weight like cooling metal remembering heat. The air tasted stale, stripped of oxygen by mechanical systems failing one chamber at a time. The forge moon exhaled one last tremor that rattled the entire corridor from floor to ceiling. A final vibration traveled through the walls. The lights flickered once, then stabilized in a dim, muted glow. The air settled. The groaning of metal subsided. The tremors faded into a silence that felt neither peaceful nor threatening, only empty. Avidian's last breath had finally dissipated. The forge moon had become hollow. The path back toward the upper levels felt lighter but lonelier. The atmosphere no longer carried devotion or pain. It held only remnants of heat and echoes of collapse. The silence pressed in from all directions, filling the vacuum left behind by the absence of the Iron Confessor's presence. By the time the upper platform came into view, the air felt thin and stripped of resonance. The corridors emptied of their oppressive weight. The forge moon had lost its pulse. It existed now only as a shell, cooling, quiet and spent. Nothing watched from the shadows anymore. Nothing breathed in the depths. The devotion that once consumed this place had extinguished itself completely, leaving behind only metal cooling in the aftermath of a fire too intense to sustain.